The silver cups that could speak. There is a small limestone object in the Louvre, in the Great Gallery of Antiquities from Iran, that most visitors walk past without a second glance. It is called the Table o' Lion, the Lion Table, and it is not much to look at. A block of pale stone, a worn carving of a reclining lion, and across its surface, columns of small, careful marks. The marks are not cuneiform, those familiar wedges pressed into clay that we associate with ancient Mesopotamia. They are something else. They are lines and curves and little geometric figures, neatly arranged, plainly deliberate, plainly a kind of writing. And for more than 100 years after the object came out of the ground, no one alive could read a single word of them. It was dug up at Susa, in the southwest of what is now Iran, in the very first years of the 20th century, around 1903, by French archaeologists working under a concession from the Persian crown. Susa was one of the great cities of the ancient world, a place so old that by the time the Persian kings of the Bible built their palaces there, it was already unimaginably ancient, a city with a memory stretching back thousands of years before them. And in the deep layers, beneath the Persians, beneath the Babylonians, beneath nearly everything, the excavators kept turning up these inscriptions in the strange linear script. They gave it a sensible, descriptive name. They called it Linear Elamite, because it came from the land the Mesopotamians called Elam, and because its signs were drawn in lines rather than pressed in wedges. The name was easy. Everything after the name was very, very hard. To understand why it resisted for so long, and why its eventual unraveling is such a quietly remarkable story, you have to sit for a moment with just how little there was to work with. When a script is lost, the people trying to recover it are in a peculiar kind of darkness. They usually need one of two lucky gifts. The first gift is a bilingual, a single text written in the unknown script, and also in a script you already know, saying the same thing in two languages, so that the known half becomes a key to the unknown half. This was the gift that cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Rosetta Stone, with its Greek at the bottom that scholars could already read. The second gift is sheer volume, thousands and thousands of texts, enough that the patterns inside the script begin to give themselves away by repetition and context, the way you might slowly learn the rules of a game by watching it played a great many times. Linear Elamite had neither gift. There were only a handful of inscriptions, a few dozen at most, scattered across objects of stone and clay and metal. And there was no clean bilingual, no obliging Rosetta Stone laying the unknown beside the known. There was something tantalizingly close to one, and we will come to it, but it was a flawed and partial thing that frustrated as much as it helped. So for the whole of the 20th century, Linear Elamite sat in a kind of scholarly limbo, occasionally picked up by a hopeful researcher, occasionally the subject of a paper proposing a few sign values, but never truly read. It became one of those famous undeciphered scripts, spoken of in the same breath as the Indus Valley seals and the linear are of Minoan Crete, a small permanent monument to the limits of what we can recover from the deep past. Now, to feel the weight of this, it helps to know who the Elamites were, because they are one of the great forgotten civilizations, forgotten not because they were small, but because they have been standing in someone else's shadow for 4,000 years. We tell the story of early civilization as the story of Mesopotamia, of Sumer and Akkad and Babylon, of the land between the two rivers. And that story is true. But just to the east, across the Tigris, up onto the Iranian plateau and down into the lowland plain of Khuzestan, there was another world, contemporary with the first, just as old, just as inventive, and in some ways stranger. This was Elam. Its great cities were Susa on the plain and Anshan up in the highlands, and its people spoke a language that was not Semitic like Akkadian and not anything like Sumerian, a language with no known relatives anywhere on Earth, what linguists call an isolate, a tongue that seems to have arrived from nowhere and to have left no descendants. For thousands of years, Elam and Mesopotamia were locked together as neighbors are, trading, intermarrying, raiding, conquering one another in turn. The Elamites at one point sacked Babylon and carried off its most sacred treasures, including the great law stele of Hammurabi, which is why that famous monument sits today in the Louvre, having been dug up not in Babylon but in Susa, where the Elamites had taken it as a trophy. And here is the deep oddity at the center of the Elamite story, the thing that makes it more than a footnote to Mesopotamia. The Elamites had invented writing themselves, independently, very early, perhaps almost as early as the Sumerians did. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, in the same centuries that the first cuneiform was taking shape in the Mesopotamian cities, the people of the Iranian plateau were developing their own system, which scholars call Proto-Elamite. It covers clay tablets, thousands of them, mostly accounts and records, and it is, to this day, almost entirely unreadable. Proto-Elamite is the older, deeper mystery, the script beneath the script. And then, after Proto-Elamite faded, centuries later, the Linear Elamite that we have been talking about appears, used for a few hundred years in the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, roughly 2,300 to 1,900 years before the Common Era, and then it too fell out of use, abandoned in favor of borrowed Mesopotamian cuneiform, and was forgotten. So when those French excavators pulled the table o' lion from the soil of Susa, they were holding a message in the lost voice of a lost civilization, a civilization that had taught itself to write, and then, across the long erosion of time, had had its writing taken from it. The signs were there. The meaning was gone. There was one figure from antiquity who hovered over the whole problem, a king with a wonderful name, Puzur-Inshushinak. He ruled at Susa around 2,100 years before the Common Era, a moment when Elam was briefly throwing off Mesopotamian domination and asserting itself. And Puzur-Inshushinak was a great builder and a proud king, who seems to have wanted, very deliberately, to promote the writing of his own Elamite language in its own native script, rather than in the cuneiform of his powerful neighbors. Inscriptions associated with his reign were carved in both systems, in Akkadian cuneiform and in Linear Elamite, and for a long time these were the great hope of decipherment, because they looked like they might be a bilingual, the longed-for key. But when scholars examined them closely, the hope curdled into frustration. The two halves did not seem to be saying the same thing. The Akkadian text spoke of one matter, the Linear Elamite text of another. They were neighbors on the stone, but not translations of one another. So the would-be Rosetta Stone turned out to be two monologues sharing a wall, and the door stayed shut. This is roughly where the matter rested for the better part of a century. A small corpus, a near-bilingual that wasn't quite, a language isolate with no relatives to lean on, and a script that nobody could read. It is the kind of problem that quietly defeats generations. What changed, in the end, was the arrival of new texts, and the arrival of new texts is itself a story with an uncomfortable edge to it. In the years around 2018, a group of inscribed objects became available to scholars that transformed the whole situation. They were silver vessels, beakers, and cups, 8 or 9 of them, of a type sometimes called gunagi vessels, beautiful and fragile, each carrying a Linear Elamite inscription running around it. Suddenly, the corpus of readable signs was meaningfully larger, and crucially, these new texts were of a kind that gave the decipherers something to grip. The uncomfortable edge is that these vessels did not come from a controlled archaeological excavation. They surfaced on the antiquities market, which usually means they were dug up illicitly, their find spots unrecorded, their archaeological context destroyed in the act of looting. This is a genuine shadow over the whole enterprise, and honest scholars have not hidden from it. An object without a provenance is an object that has been torn loose from the only thing that could fully authenticate it and explain it, and some critics have argued that you cannot build a decipherment on a foundation of unprovenanced, market-bought artifacts, whose very genuineness cannot be independently confirmed. It is a real objection. It sits underneath everything that follows, and a careful person keeps it in mind even while marveling at what was done with the material. Because what was done with the material was genuinely clever. The person at the center of it is a French archaeologist named François de Sète, who had spent years working on the Iranian plateau and who had developed an almost obsessive familiarity with the small body of linear Elamite signs. And the method he and his collaborators used was, in its bones, the same method that had cracked another lost script 2 centuries before. The method that a young German schoolteacher named Georg Friedrich Grotefend had used around 1802 to make the first breakthrough into Old Persian cuneiform. The principle is simple to state and devilishly hard to execute. You look for the names of kings. Here is the logic of it. In a royal inscription, the parts most likely to be names, and most likely to be names you can already identify from other sources, are the names of the rulers themselves. If you know from Mesopotamian records, written in scripts you can read, that a certain king ruled at a certain time and bore a certain name, and if you can find in your unknown script a repeated sequence of signs sitting exactly where a royal name ought to sit, at the head of an inscription, in the position of the one who commissioned it, then you can make a guess. You can guess that this sequence of unknown signs spells that known name. And if you are right, then suddenly each sign in that sequence is no longer a mute shape. It is a sound. A king's name is a little bundle of phonetic values waiting to be unpacked, and once unpacked, those values can be carried to other words, other inscriptions, and tested again. So de Sète went looking for kings in the silver. And the Elamite dynasty of this period, the line sometimes called the Sukalma or the Shimashki rulers, was known from Mesopotamian sources. There were names on record. And among the sign sequences inscribed on the vessels, he found one that began with a sign he suspected stood for the sound she, and that ended with a repeated syllable, a doubling at the end. There was a known Elamite ruler whose name fit that exact shape, a king called Shilhaha, with that distinctive repetition at the end. It was a hypothesis, nothing more, a hunch about a shape. He tried it. He assigned the sounds. And the hypothesis held. The reading was coherent. And then, the account goes, within minutes, with those few sign values now in hand, he found himself reading the name of Shilhaha's predecessor. The king understood to be his father, a ruler named Eparti or Eberet, Epartai. 2 kings in a row, falling out of the silver, confirming each other. There is a particular kind of joy in this that anyone who has ever solved a hard puzzle will recognize. The moment when a guess that could have been wrong turns out to be right, and then immediately pays a second dividend you weren't expecting, is one of the great pleasures of intellectual work, and it must have been overwhelming to feel it here, with a script that had been silent for 100 years and unread for 4,000. From 2 royal names he had extracted a handful of confirmed sound values, signs for E and Ha and L, and Pa and Pi, and Rai and Sha and Tai. And these joined the values he could already propose from the older Puserinchashinek material, the Na and the R and the Shi. And once you have a dozen secure signs, the thing begins to cascade, because each new word you can partly read constrains the values of the signs you don't yet know, narrows the possibilities, lets you guess again with better odds. He found, among the readings, the name of the great god of the Iranian highlands, Napirisha, whose name the Elamites themselves seem to have built from their own words. Napi for god and Risha for great, the great god, written out syllable by syllable in the linear signs. There is something moving in that, in recovering not just the bookkeeping of a vanished people, but the name of the god they thought was greatest, spelled in the script they invented to honor him. The texts on the vessels turned out to be the kinds of things you would expect a king to commission, dedications, statements of who had made the object, and for whom the small formulae of royal and religious self-presentation that echo across all the ancient world. By the time the work was gathered together and published, in the summer of 2022, in a long and detailed scholarly paper, Dissett and his co-authors were prepared to make a very large claim. They argued that they could now read essentially the whole of Linear Elamite, that the script was no longer a mystery but a known quantity. And they made a second claim, larger still, about the nature of the script itself. They argued that Linear Elamite was purely phonetic, that every sign stood for a sound, a vowel or a consonant or a simple consonant plus vowel syllable, and that none of the signs were what scholars call logograms, signs that stand for a whole word or idea rather than a sound, the way our numeral or our ampersand stands for a concept rather than a pronunciation. This distinction sounds technical, but it carries an enormous implication. Cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs are both mixed systems, full of logograms alongside their phonetic signs. A script that is purely phonetic, that has fully made the leap to representing language as pure sound, is a more abstract and in some sense more advanced kind of invention. And if Linear Elamite was purely phonetic, and if it was as old as it appeared to be, then it might be the oldest purely phonetic writing system known anywhere on Earth, older than the alphabet, a claim that would rewrite a chapter in the history of human communication and would relocate one of the great inventions of the mind from the Mediterranean world to the Iranian plateau. That is a thrilling thing to claim. It is exactly the kind of grand, reframing assertion that makes headlines, and it did make headlines around the world. And it is exactly the kind of claim that brings other scholars to their feet, not all of them applauding. Because this is the part of the story that the headlines tended to leave out, and it is in many ways the most interesting part, the part where we move from the romance of the lone decipherer to the slower, more careful, more skeptical machinery of how knowledge actually gets tested. A decipherment is not true because its author feels the click of certainty. It is true if it is true because it can be checked, because it makes successful predictions, because when you apply its sign values to texts the author never saw, sensible language comes out. And on those grounds, a number of very serious scholars looked at the Linear Elamite decipherment and said, not so fast. One of the most prominent skeptics was Jacob Dahl, a scholar at Oxford and one of the leading experts in the world on early Mesopotamian and Iranian writing, a man who has spent his career precisely on these difficult scripts. Dahl questioned the central claim that the script was purely phonetic. He doubted, too, that the scattered corpus, drawn from different places and centuries, and now swollen with these unprovenanced market objects, really represented a single unified tradition of writing at all, rather than a looser family of related sign systems that might not all obey the same rules. If the texts are not one tradition, then sign values proven in one place may not transfer cleanly to another, and the whole edifice becomes shakier. Another scholar, the linguist Michael Metter at the University of Bern, made a more specific and in some ways more pointed objection. He argued, from his own study, that only around 70% of the Linear Elamite signs behave like pure phonetic signs, and that the remaining 30% look like logograms, signs for whole words. If Metter is right, then the grandest claim, the claim of a purely phonetic system, the world's first, simply falls. It would still be a real and important script, a real decipherment in large part, but not the revolutionary thing it was announced as. And Metter's summary judgment was bracing in its caution. Until clear evidence is provided, he said, Linear Elamite should still be considered undeciphered. There was also a sharper, more public quarrel, conducted partly in the pages of magazines and on scholarly blogs, over how the story had been told to the public, with at least one specialist publishing a stern rejoinder accusing the popular coverage of overstating the certainty and underplaying the doubts, and of glossing over the troubling matter of those looted, unprovenanced vessels on which so much rested. These disputes can look unseemly from the outside, scholars sniping at one another, but they are in fact the immune system of knowledge doing its work. The necessary friction by which a bold claim is either polished into accepted fact or worn down into a footnote. So where does that leave us, lying here in the dark, turning this over? It leaves us, I think, in a genuinely interesting and unfinished place, which is the most honest place a story like this can leave us. It is not the tidy triumph that the first wave of coverage suggested, the lone genius who cracked the code and closed the book. Nor is it a debunking, a case of a claim collapsing under scrutiny. It is something more lifelike than either. A serious, ingenious piece of work, almost certainly right in many of its particulars. The royal names do seem to read, the method is sound and has a distinguished pedigree, and yet still contested in its largest and most exciting claims, still waiting on the one thing that would settle it, which is more text, more securely excavated text, ideally a real bilingual pulled cleanly from undisturbed ground. That would let the decipherment prove itself by reading something no one had arranged for it to read. And underneath the specific quarrel about phonetic signs and logograms and provenance, there is the larger thing that I keep coming back to, the thing that makes this more than a technical episode in the history of scholarship. It is the fact of independent invention. We are accustomed, in the way we usually tell it, to thinking of writing as a thing that was invented once, or nearly once, in Mesopotamia, and then spread outward from that single hearth, carried by trade and conquest and imitation, until the whole literate world was lit from that one original flame. And there is truth in that picture for much of the world. But Elam complicates it. Here, on the Iranian plateau, right next door to Mesopotamia and in constant contact with it, a people seems to have reached for writing on their own, more than once, first with the Proto-Elamite tablets that we still cannot read at all, and then again, centuries later, with the Linear Elamite that we may finally be beginning to read. They could have simply borrowed cuneiform, and in the end they did. The linear script faded and the wedges took over. But for a few centuries, there was a deliberate, even defiant insistence on writing the Elamite language in an Elamite way. A king like Puzur-Inshushinak consciously promoting his own script as an assertion of who his people were, distinct from the great civilization next door. That is the resonant thing, the thing worth carrying down into sleep. Writing was not a single miracle handed once to one people. It was a thing that the human mind reached for in more than one place, in more than one shape, an itch that different peoples scratched differently, sometimes inventing the whole apparatus from scratch, and then, for reasons of politics and convenience and the long, slow pressure of a powerful neighbor's example, letting their own versions slip away. The silver cups of Elam are messages from one of those roads not taken, or taken for a while and then abandoned. A way of writing that flourished and was forgotten and lay silent in the ground at Susa and on the dealers' tables for 4,000 years, until someone guessed that a doubled syllable at the end of a name might be the sound ha. And the cups, very faintly, began to speak again. Whether they are speaking clearly yet, or only murmuring, is a question the scholars will go on arguing, patiently, text by text, sign by sign, as scholars do. There is no hurry. The cups have waited 4,000 years. They can wait a little longer for us to be sure we have understood them. And the lion on the limestone table, who has lain there reclining through all of it, through the rise and fall of Elam and the silence of the centuries and the bright noise of the announcement and the quieter murmur of the doubts, goes on keeping his counsel in a script we are still, slowly, gently, learning how to read.